December 28th, 9:12 a.m., and I'm standing there with my badge in one hand, a black Pelican case in the other, and Mitchell, Lexora's new VP of Ops, smirking across the glass like he just outmaneuvered God. "We're optimizing headcount for Q1, he says, barely pretending it's not personal. "Effective immediately, your role's been sunset." He doesn't even sit. Just watches me, all smug and slick in his unearned blazer, like he expects me to cry or beg or clutch my pearls. Then he adds it, the line that splits the room temperature like a cracked refrigerant pipe. "You really think anyone hires women your age in DevSec?" My fingers tighten slightly on the case handle. Not enough to betray emotion, just enough to register the weight of what I'm still carrying. I glance up at the glowing wall monitor counting down to Lexora's New Year maintenance freeze. 4 days. The system's about to lock itself down tighter than Fort Knox for 2 weeks of automated updates, firewall rotations, and reboot cycles no intern could survive without taking out half the production environment. And Mitchell, this smug, soft-handed dipshit, thinks he just optimized me. I nod once. Not because I accept it, but because I've already planned for this. Before I continue, a quick ask: 97% of people who listen to stories like this don't subscribe. If you're enjoying this so far, hit that subscribe button and like the video. It helps more than you know and keeps this madness going. Now, back to the beginning. Lexora Digital wasn't even called Lexora when I started. It was just a raw-boned idea a founder named Elena scribbled on a whiteboard in Tempe back when everyone thought hybrid infrastructure was just another tech buzzword for "you'll need a bigger server room." We bootstrapped the first year. No investors, just caffeine, midnight commits, and me rewriting access logic by hand because AWS's identity tools were still in toddler mode. I built the continuity layers from scratch. Cold failovers in different regions, redundant credential chains, and heartbeat monitors that pinged physical devices every 30 seconds to prevent stale state corruption. I was the only one who knew where every key store lived, who had access, who used to, who shouldn't anymore. They don't give awards for that. You just hear the silence of systems that don't fail. That was my reward. Until we started getting contracts from defense clients. Until uptime became not just a bragging point, but a legal requirement. The system couldn't go down, not even for scheduled maintenance. That's when they let me write the continuity protocol myself. And I embedded the clause. Clause 18C, page 12 of my contract. Not even hidden. Just quietly initialed by me and the old CEO 3 years ago after our then CTO accidentally deployed a beta build into production on Christmas Eve, bricking 2 services for 72 seconds and almost getting us dropped from a key federal platform. If terminated within 7 days of a maintenance window and cloud credentials are deemed essential, the employee must be retained or consulted until the freeze is lifted, or full bonus paid in advance. Not a threat. A fail-safe. Mitchell never read it. HR didn't understand it, but the clause sat there, binding, quiet. I taped a printed copy inside the lid of my case. By design, I never cloned the primary dongle. Lexora's master production environment, our core AWS vault, S3 access policies, identity keychains, and deployment pipeline route was authenticated through a single device. That's what made it secure. If I were hit by a bus, there was a backup protocol. If I were fired, well, that depended on the calendar. And now it was December 28th. 3 days ago, I'd asked Jake, our new HR lead, about renewing my elevated access for the annual maintenance freeze. He blinked like I'd asked him to approve a space launch. Said he'd circle back. That night, my permissions dropped from admin to audit only. The day after, I lost Slack access. Then I got flagged for a random audit of my key locker, one that oddly didn't require my presence. Just a log update saying the device had been retrieved, except it hadn't. I still had the dongle, encrypted, tagged, untouched, and now Mitchell thinks he's done something clever. I look him straight in the eye and say nothing, because there's no need. The timer's running, not just on the freeze, but on them figuring out how badly they just screwed themselves. As I pass the glass wall on the way out, I catch the CTO, Andrew Lee, rounding the corner. His eyes drop to the box in my hand. He freezes. The blood drains from his face. "Tell me that's a joke," he whispers, staring at the black case like it's radioactive. I don't blink, don't flinch. I just keep walking. 3 weeks before the freeze, I sent the same email I'd sent every year since we institutionalized the maintenance cycle. A quick heads up to HR, IT, and Ops requesting a 2-week elevated access flag under continuity protocol. Routine, standard, boring. I even included the boilerplate legal phrasing. Per infrastructure access continuity procedure 7.1, elevated privileges required for root key store oversight December 29th through January 12th. Jake, our new HR rep, fresh from a tech startup that collapsed faster than its first funding round, replied 2 days later, "Got it. We'll look into it." The smiley face was cute. The follow-up silence wasn't. Then, the first glitch. My admin shell access kicked me to audit only. I assumed it was a permissions refresh, nothing urgent. Then my Slack account threw an unauthorized user message. Then my badge stopped opening the secondary server corridor on sublevel 2. Still, I didn't panic. I just sat at my terminal, drinking lukewarm gas station coffee, and pulled up my original employment agreement. Page 12, subsection 18C. A clause I wrote in the aftermath of the Christmas incident. Back when our then CTO, in a caffeine-fueled state of ego, had deployed an experimental autoscaler script to prod and accidentally nuked our entire US East failover array. 72 seconds of downtime. I remember every single one of them because I was on a call with a government client when the API gateway failed. I had to manually reroute traffic, re-authenticate the vault, and suppress all auto alerts until the hotfix loaded. After that, I asked the CEO for clause writing privileges. She laughed. I didn't. So now, clause 18C. If terminated within 7 days of a maintenance window and cloud credentials are deemed essential, the employee must be retained or consulted until the freeze is lifted, or a full bonus paid in advance. Essential credentials was defined in Appendix D, another document I drafted in case some joker tried to call the clause unclear. It listed 3 credentials. The top one, the primary root dongle, serial ending in A7F1 in my possession. And here's the funny part. That clause wasn't just buried legalese, it was time-stamped, signed by me and co-signed by Andrew Lee himself. The same CDO who once told me over beers that if I ever quit, he'd personally drive to my house to beg me to stay. Different tune now, I'm guessing. When I saw my permissions vanish, I didn't escalate. I didn't storm into HR or ping legal or even call in a favor from compliance. I printed clause 18C, trimmed it with scissors, and taped it inside the lid of my Pelican case like a little paper sword, just in case someone tried to fake the handoff. And sure enough, someone did. On Thursday, a systems log registered a hardware credential handoff completed to IT. The access log included my name. But I hadn't been there. No one had asked for my badge. And the serial they listed didn't match mine. They logged the dummy backup key we used for onboarding demos, the one that couldn't access production if it begged. That's when I knew someone was trying to offboard me quietly, without setting off the clause. A ghost termination. Keep it light, let permissions bleed out slowly, make me disappear before the freeze started. Smart on paper, dangerous in practice, because while they were playing politics, the system was ticking toward a hard lockout. December 31st, midnight. That's when all non-root credentials automatically suspended under continuity lockdown and override required dual confirmation, one of them being mine. They could fake my badge. They could even spoof a Slack deactivation. But that dongle? That required my biometric signature, 2 manual key twists, and a hard-seated sync to the AWS vault through our regional terminal. And it was in my case, next to the clause, taped down, waiting. The next morning, I called legal, just to confirm something benign, asked if there'd been any updates to contract terms or retention cycles. The assistant on the phone hesitated, said she'd check, and never called back. That silence confirmed more than any answer ever could. They weren't just planning to push me out. They already had. The mistake? They thought the dongle was symbolic. They thought I was obsolete, and they had no idea what day it was on the calendar. December 28th, 9:12 a.m., and Mitchell was already waiting when I walked into the glass box they called a conference room. No coffee, no pleasantries, just a stack of HR forms and that punchable millennial grindset smile like he'd just solved capitalism with a spreadsheet. "We're optimizing headcount for Q1, he said without even sitting. He said it like it was merciful, like he was freeing me from something instead of walking face first into a buzzsaw he didn't know existed. Effective, immediately, your role's been sunset. Sunset. Like I was a bad dashboard color scheme they were phasing out. Then came the cherry on the vomit sundae. He looked me over once, half pity, half performance, and added, "You really think anyone hires women your age in DevSec?" I didn't flinch, didn't blink, just followed his gaze to the wall monitor behind me, the one that displayed a live countdown in Lexora's custom blue font. Maintenance freeze begins in 4 days, IO 3 hours, 48 minutes. I could have said 1,000 things in that moment, could have torn him a new one, could have handed him a printout of Clause 18C and watched the color drain out of his neck. But I didn't. Instead, I smiled, small, not kind, and nodded once. Noted. I packed up my things like I'd planned to all along. No rush, no drama, just one small recycled box, Lexora branded ironically, with exactly 3 items. My worn badge, 2 vendor fobs I hadn't touched in years, and the encrypted USB dongle labeled primary root, still in its sealed anti-static sleeve, tethered to a braided steel lanyard I'd threaded through the case foam myself. They'd staged the walkout like it was a performance. HR waiting with a pre-signed exit sheet. Security pretending not to watch from the hallway. One of the admin girls, Jessie, lingering near the coffee machine, trying not to make eye contact. The whole thing smelled like a middle school play about layoffs. Staged, sanitized, ineffective. What they didn't know, what Mitchell didn't even think to ask, was that I'd been prepping for this scenario for 3 years. Ever since that Christmas disaster, I had contingency plans for everything. Access handoffs, clause enforcement, infrastructure restoration without internal approval. Hell, I even had a cold email draft ready to go to our largest defense client if someone yanked the plug too hard. They thought offboarding me was just about reclaiming a chair and canceling a benefits packet. They had no idea they'd just yanked the plug on their own heartbeat monitor. The building always ran cold this time of year, and the walk to the exit didn't feel particularly cinematic. The floor was quiet. Most people had taken PTO early. I moved like a ghost, half seen, half forgotten. Just another older tech woman getting shuffled off for some overpaid 20-something who could code in 7 languages but didn't know what a hard token was. At the elevator, I caught a reflection of myself in the stainless steel doors, steady, graying at the temples, coat collar up against the chill. I looked like someone's mother, someone's aunt, someone forgettable. But in my hand, I carried the most irreplaceable object in the entire organization. Mitchell caught up as I was about to step in. "What's in the box?" he asked, mock casual. I turned, held it up just slightly, and said, "The primary access dongle, synced to our AWS prod vault, per protocol." He blinked, thrown off by how blunt that was. Then he laughed, short, dismissive. "Nice bluff," he muttered, already turning back toward his glass office like he'd won something. But that's when Andrew Lee, CTO, once my fiercest advocate, came around the corner. He wasn't laughing. He saw the box, froze, eyes locked on the corner of the black case poking through the Lexora cardboard like it had teeth. Then he looked at me and whispered, "Tell me that's a joke." I didn't reply. I just stepped into the elevator and let the doors close. The hallway between Lexora's reception and the exit had always been oddly long, like someone in corporate architecture had decided fear needed a runway. Glass walls, beige carpet, muted LED lighting, and Mitchell, unfortunately, jogging up behind me in patent loafers like a man who just remembered he left the oven on. I heard the breath before the words. That smug, sticky exhale of someone who thinks they're about to win the argument they didn't know they were having. "What's that?" he asked, nodding at the black case cradled in my arms. His voice had that performative lilt, the kind HR-trained managers use to sound friendly while they panic. I didn't stop walking, didn't change my pace. "The primary access dongle," I said evenly. "It's synced to our live AWS production vault." He blinked once, took half a step back like I'd just told him I was carrying radioactive uranium. Then he laughed. Loud, sharp, way too forced. "Nice bluff," he said, waving his hand like he was batting away a joke that made him uncomfortable. We both knew he didn't understand a damn thing I'd just said. He thought dongle meant USB stick, something a Zoomer uses for a PowerPoint deck. He had no idea that this small, unlabeled device was Lexora's spinal cord, that it authenticated deployment keys, rotation scripts, and zero-day mitigation logs, that it bypassed SSO because the feds required a physical device in the custody of a human being who couldn't be socially engineered or spoofed. That person had been me, until 5 minutes ago. I kept walking, calm. 3 more steps to the doors, and then shoes squeaked behind me. Andrew Lee, CTO, white shirt rumpled, face pale. He came around the corner like he'd been yanked out of a nightmare mid-sentence. He saw the case, stopped dead, didn't speak for 3 seconds, just stared, like he was doing the math in his head and the calculator had exploded. Then, quieter than I expected, he said, "Tell me that's a joke." Mitchell looked between us, blinking like he'd walked into a scene without knowing his lines. "I mean, she's bluffing, right?" Mitchell said, still half laughing. "It's just a prop or whatever. There's no way she'd be allowed to walk out with..." Andrew didn't move, didn't blink. "She's the credentialed custodian," he said flatly. And just like that, the hallway changed temperature. It wasn't just a box anymore. It was a dead man's switch. Andrew took a step toward me, hands slightly raised like I was holding something fragile and flammable at the same time. His voice dropped to a whisper, almost pleading. "Please tell me you checked it back in. Please tell me there's a secondary key on file." I didn't speak, just tilted my head slightly, that half nod I give when someone already knows the answer and wants me to lie. Andrew cursed under his breath. "Jesus, no clone on file. You kept it non-replicated, didn't you?" "Per protocol," I replied softly. Mitchell finally clued in that something real was happening. "Okay, wait, what does that mean? There's backups, right?" Andrew's laugh was cold and sharp. "Sure, backups, all locked behind her biometric sync and a physical handoff token she never filed for redundancy because we told her not to." He turned to me. "Right? Legal shot down the second key request in May, didn't they?" I shrugged slightly. "Said it was unnecessary. Too expensive." It was the most honest thing Legal had said all year. We stood there in that hallway for maybe 20 more seconds, but it felt like an hour. Mitchell's mouth kept opening and closing like he wanted to ask what AWS stood for, but was too proud to admit he didn't know. Andrew just kept staring at the case like it might grow legs and sprint into traffic. Then I said quietly, "Clause 18C activates if I'm terminated within 7 days of freeze. Full bonus or active consultation. Anything else is a breach." Andrew nodded once. His eyes dropped. The kind of nod a surgeon gives when they realize the scalpel was in the wrong hand the whole time. I turned to the doors and walked out into the bright, brittle December air, case in hand. They thought I was carrying a box. What I was really carrying was the next 2 weeks of uptime, and the receipt for $3.8 million. By noon, Mitchell's fake composure had cracked into full-blown panic, and the scramble had begun. I wasn't there to see it, of course, but Lexora wasn't subtle. I still had access to the mirrored audit logs from my offsite continuity node. Yes, the one they always forgot about because it wasn't in the org chart. And watching them from a distance was like watching toddlers realize the stove is hot after they've already touched it. The first clue came from the access control reports. Around 11:07 a.m., one of the junior sysadmins, Ravi, poor kid, started hammering the credential registry to confirm if a master override credential had been reassigned. The query repeated itself 6 times in 2 minutes, then once more from a second machine. Panic, meet documentation. But the answer didn't change. No reassignment. The primary root dongle was still assigned to user ID 147 alpha, retention level 5. That's me. Their first mistake was assuming deactivation was deletion. My login might have been disabled, but the credential chain, the actual backbone of our cloud stack, still showed me as the one and only custodian of the hardware access token, because the dongle hadn't been cloned, because it couldn't be. Protocol 8.3 of the Cloud Integrity Charter, which I helped write, prohibited cloning of Level 1 credentials unless approved by both CTO and General Counsel in writing. I drafted that clause after a mid-size fintech firm got gutted from the inside by a cloned admin key used by a bitter ex. Our system had to have one key, one person, one chain of trust, and that person had just been fired 4 days before the global systems freeze. Cue internal meltdown. At 11:23 a.m., someone from security tried to override the credential flag and manually switch the assigned custodian. Denied. Not because they didn't have permissions, but because the override required dual biometric input. One of those was still me. The other? The CEO who was on vacation in Iceland and completely unreachable. That's when they turned to the off-boarding docs. And it got worse. My off-boarding form, signed and time-stamped by Mitchell himself, listed all hardware devices returned. There was even a line for serial numbers. For the dongle, they'd written, returned SN0x808F prototype. I nearly choked on my tea when I read that. 0x808F was a dead serial. A prototype key from 2018 that hadn't been synced to our production stack in 5 years. It was used for internal demos, non-functional. No vault access, no deployment pipeline signature. Just a piece of plastic with blinking lights. Whoever wrote it in was either panicking or covering their ass, which meant someone had faked the return to tick the box. They hadn't gotten the real device, they just hoped no one would check. But Andrew had checked. Hard. I saw a new report pop in around 11:42 a.m. titled Active Vault Credential Inventory, Pre-Freeze Confirmation. He was confirming whether override would be possible once the maintenance window began. That's when it would get critical. See? Once Lexora entered freeze mode, midnight on the 31st, the system initiated a full lockdown of elevated functions. Deployment halted, credential refresh paused, vault access dropped to read only. If anything glitched, if a single microservice broke mid-patch, the only way to repair it was with the master key override. That override now required the dongle, which was currently sitting in my hallway closet inside a locked firebox next to a printed copy of Clause 18C, 2 notarized affidavits of credential custody, and the best damn ceramic mug collection in Tempe. I imagine Mitchell pacing like a panicked cat, trying to call someone, anyone with clearance, but he wouldn't get far. Legal couldn't issue a retroactive reassignment. Compliance couldn't fudge the logs without triggering a federal audit flag. And the audit logs? Immutable. I made sure of that. Every keystroke, every override attempt, every panicked escalation, already captured and mirrored to off-site cold storage by the time they typed it. It was only noon. And the freeze was coming. They hadn't just cut me loose. They'd cut out their own pacemaker. And now they were trying to defibrillate a system with a paperclip and a prayer. By 10:47 p.m., someone in legal finally stopped hoping and started reading. Not just the policy manuals or the employee handbook, which Mitchell probably thought covered everything, but the individual contracts. Mine, specifically. And buried in that PDF, which had lived untouched in their DocuSign archive for 3 years, they found it. Page 12, subsection 18C. Highlighted in faint yellow, initialed in the corner by me and, most importantly, by Jenna Roth, the former CEO who actually read what she signed. Access custodians required for high-privilege credential cycles must be compensated full retention bonus if removed within 7 days of the annual freeze. 17 words, 7 figures, 3 days too late. From what I gathered later through quiet channels and a few sympathetic friends who'd survived the shakeup, the discovery triggered what one paralegal called the longest minute of silence in Lexora's legal history. They checked the timestamps. Mitchell had fired me, formally, on record, on December 28th at 9:12 a.m. The freeze? Set for January 1st at 12 a.m., 4 days. He had violated the clause by 72 hours and change. Worse, Lexora had issued a formal statement of my termination internally, updated HRIS, and filed exit documentation with their insurance carrier and compliance registry. The clause wasn't just triggered, it was documented 6 different ways. And then came the real punch in the teeth. The system couldn't be rebooted without me. Clause 18C didn't just trigger a bonus payout. It also rendered certain operational overrides contractually dependent on my presence. Or, at minimum, my signed release. Not because I demanded it, because the feds did. See, our largest client, ironically the same one whose onboarding I'd personally led 3 years earlier, had specific continuity requirements for credential control during sensitive periods. A chain of custody clause, Appendix E9 in their master SLA. It clearly stated that Any reassignment of Level 1 Vault credentials within 7 calendar days of a scheduled systems freeze must be reviewed, attested, and countersigned by the active custodian or designated alternate, as filed no less than 30 days prior. Guess how many designated alternates were on file? 0. Why? Because Mitchell had streamlined onboarding redundancies last quarter to save money. So here they were, a frozen chain of command, no secondary custodian, a high-value federal SLA hanging by a thread, and a $3.8 million retention clause glowing like a red warning light no one could shut off. And the freeze timer just kept ticking. They couldn't reboot. They couldn't patch. They couldn't even legally call the SLA compliant. At 11:06 p.m., someone flagged the compliance dashboard with a red risk active warning under the SLA for federal operations. The dashboard was integrated with our insurance policy, which meant that if the SLA breach wasn't resolved by midnight on the 31st, coverage would be considered voidable in the event of any systems failure, patch conflict, or data drift. Translation: any incident, however minor, during the freeze could become a 7-figure liability, and someone had just fired the only person capable of preventing it. I imagine Mitchell staring at the clause with that blank look he always got when someone said the word containerization, probably trying to bluff his way out of it in front of legal, suggesting they could fast-track a solution or revise the language. Too late. The language wasn't the problem. The problem was me, or rather, my absence. By 11:43 p.m., a decision was made. They'd have to pay, not because they wanted to, but because the infrastructure had been designed by someone who planned for this exact moment. And the only way out was through the clause they ignored, written by the woman they thought was disposable. At 8:06 a.m., Sharp, my attorney, Margaret, forwarded me the voicemail transcript with one dry sentence attached. Well, they're sweating. The message had come from Lexora's general counsel's office, technically a courtesy call, though there's nothing courteous about realizing you've driven your company into a contractual buzzsaw with your own signature still wet on the page. They were re-evaluating the terms of my separation, the caller said. After further internal review and updated access control disclosures, they were prepared to expedite full payout of the deferred retention bonus, and, of course, offer a competitive consulting fee for the upcoming 2-week freeze. They were trying to paint it as a fresh deal. A show of good faith, like we were all still friends who just had a little misunderstanding over who held the keys to their entire production environment. I didn't even need to respond. Margaret was already halfway through crafting the reply when I called. "I assume you're not interested in the dog and pony show," she said. "Just send the clause." Already printing it. Less than an hour later, she sent back a single PDF, 1 page, no pleasantries, no conditions, no negotiation, just a high-resolution scan of my signature page from the original 2020 continuity contract. My name, in bold. Andrew Lee's initials beside mine. A red box drawn precisely around Clause 18C. That was the entire message. No response from legal came that day, not even a read receipt. Because what could they say? That they were hoping I wouldn't notice my own clause? That their VP had cost the company 7 figures and regulatory exposure because he wanted to streamline senior talent? It wasn't a deal. It wasn't an offer. It was compliance. Clause 18C didn't ask for negotiation. It laid out exact conditions, timelines, and outcomes. If X, then Y. No interpretation, no discretion, no wiggle room. And with every minute that passed, they inched closer to the freeze window. 1 patch error away from SLA violation, 1 audit flag away from breach liability. They weren't trying to avoid paying me. They were trying to avoid headlines. Margaret didn't even bother with legal threats. She didn't need to. The clause was airtight, and in the corner of the scan, she added 1 small note. Just 2 lines in 10-point font. Payment required prior to freeze to prevent non-compliance. Consultant participation is not assured. That was the kill shot. They could wire the money, but I wasn't obligated to consult. Clause 18C didn't promise services, only that if I wasn't retained, I'd be compensated. So even if they paid me the full bonus, they still wouldn't have access to the dongle unless I chose to participate. The ball wasn't in their court. It was in free fall. And I was the only one who knew where it would land. I never set foot back in that building. Didn't need to. But Monday morning unfolded exactly the way I'd always suspected it might if the wrong idiot ever got promoted too far up the food chain without reading the infrastructure charter. From what I was told, the emergency ops review began at 7:30 a.m. sharp in what they called the glass room, an overdesigned conference tomb with floor-to-ceiling panels meant to project transparency while concealing panic. CTO Andrew Lee walked in stone-faced, holding a hard copy of the override logs. Not digital, not on a tablet. Printed. That alone told the board everything they needed to know. This was about to be very real and very bad. According to a friend still in the room, he slid the log across the glass table without a word. Pages of time-stamped failures, failed vault authentication attempts, denied override commands, rejected credential reassignment workflows, and system alerts that all circled back to one immutable line. Custodian. 0147 Alpha. Status deactivated, pending clause. 18C. They say the CIO tried to speak first, but Andrew cut him off. Just said, flatly, there is no fallback. The room went quiet. Then came the questions from the board. The kind that don't sound like questions, just knives wrapped in polite phrasing. Who approved the off-boarding sequence? Was continuity protocol consulted? Where was legal during the credential shift? And finally, when the investors joined via video, already tense, already aware from whispered channels that Lexora had ghosted its own credential policy, someone had to walk them through the sequence. They opened the incident timeline. Every decision was time-stamped. 9:12 a.m., December 28th, termination of 01147 Alpha initiated by VP of Operations Mitchell Stone. 10:31 a.m., HRIS update filed. 11:43 a.m., offboarding form submitted with mismatched device serial. 12:06 p.m., secondary override rejected, no biometric authorization available. 12:41 p.m., internal credential escalation flagged, and sitting there, in bold beneath it all, clause 18C, triggered. At that point, I'm told the chairman set his coffee down, didn't sip, didn't blink, just slowly looked around the table and asked one question, soft but loud enough to be final. You fired the root custodian 4 days before lockdown? No one spoke. Mitchell sat pale, mouth slightly open, like he was still trying to figure out what a root custodian actually did. The CFO whispered something to legal. Andrew didn't say another word, just pointed to the logs, then to the clause. No explanations, no defense, just the facts in printed ink. They didn't call me, didn't ask me to dial in, because there was nothing left to discuss. The decision had already been made, and the clock was still ticking. From what I heard, Mitchell left the building before lunch, box in hand. No comments, no goodbye post on Slack, just like I had. Except mine came with $3.8 million. His came with silence. The funds landed on December 31st at 9:04 p.m., a full 3 hours before the freeze hit. Margaret forwarded me the wire confirmation with a simple subject line. Happy New Year. No ceremony, no apology, just the money. $3.8 million exactly as calculated, plus an additional $72,000 labeled temporary continuity consulting fee. No one even asked me to show up. They just wired it. In silence. Because clause 18C didn't require my presence. It only required their compliance. I watched the freeze countdown from my laptop. I still had read-only access through a mirrored node they never decommissioned, because decommissioning it would have required my sign-off, which they'd lost the second they filed my termination. At midnight, the maintenance protocols kicked in. One by one, the systems rotated through their patch sequences. Credential syncs fired, vault integrity checks completed, every heartbeat ping confirmed alive. I monitored it like someone watching a train they used to drive. Quiet, respectful, satisfied. Everything I'd built continued, just as I'd designed. Lexora never mentioned me publicly. Instead, they pushed out a thin press release on January 4th. Lexora Digital implements updated infrastructure custodial protocols ahead of Q1. 6 paragraphs of polished nothing. No names, no causes, just strategic improvements, resilience initiatives, and leadership realignment. Mitchell was gone by the time it posted. His LinkedIn went dark for a week, then reappeared with a vague advisory role at some low-rent tech incubator. No mention of Lexora, No farewell message, just erased. The kind of corporate vanishing act that tells you exactly how hard the fall was. Because the people who liked him suddenly had nothing to say. Andrew Lee stayed. But legal oversight shifted. He now reported directly to a newly created position, Infrastructure Risk Counsel. Fancy title for someone whose entire job was to ask, "Are we about to fire the person holding the detonator?" And then came Q1 filings. I didn't expect them to say anything. But there it was, buried deep in the footnotes under the Compliance and Governance section, printed in 6-point font. Custodial oversight lapse resolved via contractual fulfillment, Clause 18C. That was it. No scandal, no lawsuit, no angry op-ed. Just a footnote that told anyone fluent in legalese that Lexora had played with fire, gotten burned, and paid full price to stop the bleeding. I sat on my porch that evening, a hot mug in my hand, the Arizona sky bleeding pink across the horizon. My phone buzzed with a message from an old friend still at Lexora. "The system's stable, no outages, just like you said it'd be." I didn't reply. Didn't need to. I hadn't raised my voice. I hadn't threatened a soul. I hadn't published a tell-all or gone nuclear on social media. I'd written the clause. I'd kept the key. And when the time came, they complied. Because the structure was stronger than the story. And I was the one who wrote both.